realities are being captured, whose are being left out, why does this matter? And the objectives for today is I talk a little bit about what we mean by evidence-based policy, give you some motivation for why inclusive development is important. And I do two case studies today to highlight blind spots. I'll talk about differently abled children, and I'll talk about women's labor force participation. I work on gender and labor markets, so the second case study is really close to my heart. Uh, and I want to close today by thinking through monitoring and evaluation systems as well. So I want to give sort of a macro overview of what data systems in developing countries, and particularly Pakistan, look like. What are the blind spots there? How do we rectify these? And I'll use the case studies to highlight issues as far as data collection methods are concerned. And I'll segue into monitoring and evaluation as well. There's now a lot of work taking place on the Global South, really focusing on monitoring and evaluation systems. So I want to take a little bit of time today to think through that there are issues in there as well that we really need to be cognizant of. So why evidence-based policy? There's now quite a concerted effort to do data-driven governance. The idea there is that anytime you're making a policy design, you want to think through the policy from a data perspective. The arguments here are that this allows for better allocation of scarce public funds. Wherever you are in the world, you don't have a huge pile of money that you can use. There's, of course, opportunity costs for allocating funds in specific manners. And we want to make the best use of the funds. I mean, ideally, we want the biggest bang for our buck, right? But we also want to be transparent while allocating funds. We want to be accountable. And really, the entire ethos behind monitoring and evaluation and having it from a data perspective is that you want to learn what is working, what is not working, for whom is it working, and scale from there. Which is why the current trend of RCTs can sometimes be problematic, because scalability when it comes to RCTs is not always immediately obvious. It's not always possible. So my focus today is not going to be on experimental methods, of course, experimental method, or on RCT. I'm really going to be talking about the Bureau of Statistics, our national surveys that are done on a regular basis. That's really going to be a focus. I am going to talk about evaluations that take place in the Global South, but really, what do these big data management systems that we have put in place, or these big surveys that we run every few years in a lot of these countries, what are the issues there? What are the blind spots there? And really, the reason why all of this matters is, of course, if you don't have, I mean, as an economist, I strongly feel that if you don't have policy backed by data and backed by evidence, you're going to start seeing policy misdiagnoses. You're going to start seeing issues as far as allocation of funds is concerned. But more importantly, if you don't have data that is inclusive, you're going to start seeing citizens being left behind. They're not going to see service being delivered to them. And that is fundamental rights of citizens being violated. This is intrinsically important for us that anytime we're doing evidence-based policy designs, we are being inclusive, because this has an issue of intrinsic rights of citizens. But in a lot of cases, making sure that you are targeting the right people and also making sure that you're not excluding the most vulnerable and marginalized individuals in society has instrumental importance as well. My go-to example for this is that when you're excluding women, and you're excluding women when it comes to education, health, you have intergenerational effects. You have catch-on effects on the next generation, because women are instrumentally important for making sure that your children are healthier, that your children have high human capital. So anytime you exclude women from poverty alleviation programs, for example, you're going to start seeing effects that cascade and possibly multiply 30, 40 years down the line, as well as you look at the generations beyond the older women in your population right now. So if you're excluding the most vulnerable and the most marginalized, which sometimes does tend to be the case because they're just harder to reach when it comes to these national surveys, then when you scale, are you really scaling as far as the correct population, so-called correct populations are concerned? Now, if you think about data in the developing country context, there are a lot of surveys being fielded. You have the mix being fielded, you have the demographic and health surveys, which unfortunately, given the most recent budget cuts for USAID, has now been stopped. You have a lot of concentrated surveys. Any country, be it Mexico, be it Bolivia, be it Pakistan, be it Bangladesh, that has cash transfers is seeing evaluations of those cash transfers done. You have health surveys, you have education surveys, system, EMIS systems as well in place. But like I said a few minutes ago, what I also want us to think through today is the Bureau of Statistics that are there in all of these countries. What are the sampling frames like? What is the instrument design like? What are the options being provided in these instruments? So as I said, if you start thinking about exclusion of marginalized populations, one of the first things that you need to consider is what is the language in which the instrument is being done? What is the indicators that are being included? Are enumerators trained in the language that your marginalized populations speak in? What is the gender of the enumerator? So there's a lot of questions that you have to ask if you want to make sure that the data that you are gathering is really going to be a representation, a true representation of the population in that country. And it's not going to be a representative sample of just specific, easier to reach or easier to survey population. And in that, as somebody who works in the gender and labor field, what I find particularly problematic is actually when I want to survey men, because it's easy for me and my enumerators to go into the field during the day, 9 to 5, anytime 9 to 5. And at that point, you find the women in the household, but you won't find the men in the household. Now, in contexts like Pakistan, where there's very strict division of roles, women will have a very good understanding of what takes place in the household. They'll have a good understanding of what is happening in the kitchen, what is happening vis-a-vis with regard to the children, but they won't necessarily know how much the husband earns, or won't necessarily know the ins and outs of all of the finances of the household. So you have to think about the timing of the survey. You have to think about which days you go, which seasons you go in. And if you want to be truly representative, sometimes you'll have to change the mode of your surveys. You'll have to do perhaps couple your face-to-face surveys with follow-up phone interviews, which is what I've done in certain instances. Now, when you start playing with the mode of the survey, one, your attrition rate tends to go down, but also at the same time, when you start playing with the type of questions that you are asking, a lot of times you see that the changes in the questionnaires that you're doing helps shed new light in the data that you're gathering. So I have an example here of the 2007 Pakistan Time Use Survey. Now, this was a really extensive diary-based survey that was done in Pakistan. And what we found was that rural women in Punjab were working 6+ hours a day. So those that were being classified as not part of the labor force, as far as the Pakistan Labor Force Survey was concerned, when you did a time use survey with them, you realize that, they are working. So it points to having these different types of surveys allows you to get different perspectives on the population and enriches your understanding of the population. I'll continue with this discussion as we move on, and my piece that I'll keep repeating throughout this lecture today is that yes, we want to have those snapshots of the population, but what we want to do is that regularize your national surveys, which are done every 2 years, in such a way, make them so that they're more inclusive and more representative of the population. So time use surveys are great, but Pakistan has only seen one time use survey that was done in 2007. Now, how do I make sure that my LFS becomes broad enough that I'm able to capture this work that your rural women are doing that is perhaps being not being captured to the extent that I needed to in my national service. Now, why is this important? I want to go back to this idea of evaluation. Now, generally speaking, when we design surveys, we are looking at information on a specific problem. We want to gather information on around that specific problem so that we understand the process. Now, A population A has a problem as far as has a problem as far as poverty is concerned. What are the mechanisms that makes a see its income fall below a certain threshold level? If I understand the mechanisms that are at play for this particular population that causes their income to fall below a particular threshold, then I can figure out where to intervene. Is it that populations are falling below the poverty threshold because there is a shock, macro shock that happens in the economy? Maybe a flood happens, maybe you have a heat wave coming, or is it a more household specific shock that perhaps there is a health shock that is experienced by certain members of the household? Or is it that anytime you have inflationary crises, there are certain populations that are just unable to absorb and their consumption falls too low? So if I understand the mechanisms that are at play, I will know where to intervene, what incentives to provide. But I want to close the loop. I want to then evaluate and figure out whether or not my intervention worked and raise this population that was below the poverty line to a point that is above the poverty line. From today's perspective, sorry, let me go back to my presentation more. From today's perspective, it's the second and the fifth that I'm interested in. Who am I going to when I'm trying to understand and define particular problems in my population? Are there any subpopulations? Are there any geographical areas? Are there any particular types of subpopulations or groups that are being left out? And even when I'm evaluating, are there any groups that are being excluded? Because if there are certain groups being excluded at the evaluation phase, then that means that I don't really know whether or not my intervention worked for them. It may have worked on those who were right above the poverty line, for example. They were 5 cents above the poverty line, but it may not have worked for the people who were $2 below the poverty line. So I need to think carefully about my evaluation populations as well. Now, so what if I'm missing out certain populations, right? On average, let's say my poverty in my country is going down over time. And that's what my monitoring and evaluation systems are showing, that on average, given the population that I'm serving, the poverty line is, people are rising above the poverty line. Now, as a policymaker, I want to be able to do my best for those who are most in need. But what I also want to highlight is that from a design perspective, if I create interventions that are targeting the most marginalized and the most vulnerable and the hardest to reach, and I'm able to improve their living condition, if I'm able to solve the problem for those who are the hardest hit, a lot of times other groups' issues sort themselves out. So if I design a mechanism, or if I design a system for the hardest or the most vulnerable or the most marginalized population, then typically that system will get things right or will work for for those who are less marginalized, or those who are less vulnerable, or those who are slightly easier to reach. So it is, so think about it in a twofold way. One, I want to be able to reach all of my population from a policy perspective, particularly when it comes to, let's say, poverty reduction, or improving health, or improving education system, or making sure that unemployment is going down. I want to reach those who are in the most vulnerable positions. But from a design perspective, I also want to be able to say that, look, I've designed for the worst hit. And since I've designed for the worst hit, usually what I see is that other subgroups just sort themselves out because my design automatically caters for them. So let's come to Pakistan. Pakistan, like Shahbar had highlighted in the introduction, is actually pretty data rich. We see heavy data collection. Every 2 years, we have the PSLM or the highest. The latest round of the highest is actually going to be a digital highest. The LFS is run uh, pretty much annually. It has been, we have a really a very high level of cross-sectional data available of the LFS since 1990. I mentioned the mix and the DHS earlier. Unfortunately, the fate of these surveys is not necessarily very clear at the moment. We have the World Values Survey. So if you start looking at how much our population is surveyed, it's quite a bit. The issue is that the marginalized and the vulnerable groups are not necessarily represented in it, in all of these national surveys that are run. If you look at the informal sector, it's not very well surveyed. Slums are regularly left out, differently abled individuals. We know that, and I talk about how we know all of this, differently abled individuals are also left out. But it's not just the marginalized and the vulnerable groups that are being left out. What is really interesting is that if you start looking at the PSLM in a lot more detail and start analyzing the income variable in the PSLM, you very quickly realize that the high income groups are being left out as well. If the high income groups are not being reached, and so we don't really understand the level of inequality in our country. Conflict-ridden areas, a lot of times it's very, really hard to get there, so they get left out of our sampling frames on a regular basis. Caste and ethnicity, we are a highly multilingual country. We have quite a lot of cleavages when you look at caste, ethnicity, biradri. Those are not adequately captured in our national level surveys as well. So that means that when it comes to really understanding what are the underlying mechanisms that are there maybe driving marginalization, we don't necessarily have a good handle on them if we just start looking at our national level surveys. Now, there are a lot of concentrated surveys like I talked about. There are surveys that are run on a regular basis by international groups such as World Bank or ADB, which look at specific portions of the population. We, in the last 10, 20 odd years, have seen a lot of students doing surveys as well on our population. So PhD theses have come out quite a bit on Pakistan. So we have pockets of surveys. But I find it incredibly telling that there is no panel survey in Pakistan. So we are not taking a group of individuals and following them at a national level for a considerable length of time, which means that we don't really understand. So as good as the LFS is, as frequently as it's run, I don't really know what is keeping people in the labor market, what is driving people out of the labor market, because I don't have a panel survey that follows individuals all the way up from their early childhood years or to their retirement, like you do in high income economies. And don't worry, I will talk about budget issues as we move in this presentation as well. Because of course, one of the reasons why we don't have these panel surveys is because they're quite expensive to run. Now, on the left-hand side of this slide, I have made the claim that marginalized and vulnerable groups are not being represented. Now, some of this I can see very clearly from the data. Like I've said, high-income groups, the 2015 PSLM, I think, had the highest income earner in the sample at 450,000 a month. And we know that incomes go higher than that. So there is an issue as far as a lot of this sampling is concerned, which fails to capture high income groups. And a lot of times it fails to capture these high income groups because they live in gated communities. Enumerators are not allowed to go in there, but we need to think about workarounds. But what about differently abled individuals? How do I know that we are not capturing differently abled individuals appropriately? And I think one of the measures that you can really see here is just the range that is available. So the 2017 census says that 0.48% of our population is differently able, whereas UNDP has has an estimate that 6.2% of our population is differently able. There is an economist study that was done, an economist paper of 2014, which said all the way up to 14% of the population is differently able. If there were national reliable numbers, and we had repeated national level surveys, which were doing a good job of figuring out how many individuals in a population were differently able, these numbers would have converged to one number. We wouldn't see such a wide range as far as the number of differently able individuals is concerned. So I'm now going to spend a little bit of time talking about these blind spots in a lot more detail. Now, what exactly is the blind spot? First, we have to think about that. So I've talked about differently abled individuals. Is the blind spot that we're not getting the correct number of individuals with disabilities? Or is the blind spot that we're unable to figure out what is the number of children with different abilities? Or is the blind spot that we don't know how many school-going children have disabilities? Why does the question matter? The question matters because some of the blind spots may be easier to solve than others. It may be easier for me to actually go and figure out how many school-going children are attending school with disabilities. I have the UNESCO number here, which is saying that only 5% of children with moderate disabilities attend mainstream school. Now, this means that they figured out how many children are there with disabilities and then went to schools and figured out how many children who are sitting in schools have disabilities. So if we figure out what it is that we want to get at, do we want to get at the total number of individuals, or do we want to get the number of children who are in school and have disabilities? We can tweak our instruments accordingly. And remember, the policy implications of each of these questions that I have highlighted here is very different. If I'm looking at number of individuals with disabilities, I should be knowing this number. If I have to think about the design of my health systems, the design of my cities in a better way. If I'm concerned with how many school children are there with disabilities, this allows me to think through school curriculum and infrastructure better. If I don't have national data on children, school-going children with disabilities, then I can't really think about inclusive classrooms. I can't really think about as far as special educators are concerned, or really start going one step ahead and thinking about learning outcomes for differently able children. So my data, the availability of my data is having an impact on the kind of policies that I can design. And not just the overall national policies that I design, as far as, let's say, infrastructure is concerned, but also policies for particular systems. So my health system versus my education system, and even within my education system, doing a deep dive into your differently abled curriculum and the infrastructure for differently abled students. How could I resolve the blind spot as far as differently abled children is concerned? First of all, we have to think about why is there an undercount, if indeed there is an undercount. So if perhaps the undercount is because I am not defining disability properly in my surveys, or it's because there's a norm about hiding your disabled household members. If it's just a yes/no question which is being asked from the household head, and I'm given a very narrow definition, then it may well be that I leave out big portions of my population and I'm not able to count them properly. So if I want to fix this problem, I have to think about who will I ask the question, how will the question, so who will I ask the question from, how will the question be framed? And here I also need to think about the enumerator training. So when I'm asking the question, perhaps there is certain measurements that I need to do. When I'm asking the question, perhaps there is a specific formula that I need to follow. I've put up the Washington group questions here, which is, this is a short set. There are about 6 questions. And through these 6 questions, you can get to at least a better understanding of disability than the current yes/no questions that we have in our service. But of course, adding these questions does have a cost implications. If you have 6 additional questions, you have to think about what are the budget impact that it's going to have. I mean, if you think about the PSLM is probably 200 plus questions. So if you add 6 more questions, you think that no, that's not going to have a very big budget implication, but perhaps these 6 questions requires that my enumerator gets trained in a particular way. And perhaps these 6 questions requires that actually I don't talk to the head of the household, but I actually go ahead and talk to the mother of the child. So that means that for certain modules, I'm going to need that might mean for certain modules, I'm going to need the household head. For other modules, I'm going to need the father of the main breadwinner. For another module, I'm going to need the mother of the child. All of this has cost implications. So we need to think about not just the questions being added, but what are the complementarities that we need to build. And the benefit that comes to us. If for the next 5 years, my policy focus is on making sure that education is inclusive, then the cost of adding this additional module may actually be worth the benefit that it reaps for me, which is that it allows my policy to become more inclusive. I'm going to talk about another blind spot now, which is women's labor force participation. And here, the official FLFP, female labor force participation in Pakistan, is at about 23%. And this widely accepted that this underrepresents women who are doing home-based work, women who are doing informal work, who are doing seasonal, casual, or piece rate work. Now, what's interesting is that there is actually an expanded definition of FLFP within the LFS, which allows me to capture informal work or home-based work a little bit better. And yet that's not the expanded FLFP estimate is not the one that is usually reported. It is the non-expanded FLFP estimate, which is usually reported. So it's an interesting historical phenomena, I would say. And there is a long history of why these blind spots exist. I mean, we widely accept that home-based work is not properly represented, and not just in the Pakistan LFS, this is worldwide. And yet we haven't done much to resolve it. Now, why is that? One, there is a really interesting historical evolution of these surveys, and a lot of it has to do with how work was conceived in countries like on pre-partition India, in countries like Burma, and what happened to the conception of work when the British came and colonized. So a lot of our surveys have actually evolved to think about work the way that it was conceptualized in industrial Europe. And that didn't necessarily gel with the local conception of work. So as surveys started excluding what was the local conception of work, which was perhaps a little bit more inclusive of the manner in which agricultural work was taking place, or the manner in which women were a part of the economy, and they were excluded in those original British surveys that were done. What we've seen is that bias then replicated as we have moved beyond the colonial survey. And as that bias gets replicated, I'm a strong believer in that instruments reflect our bias, yes, but then bias starts to reflect what is there in the instrument as well. So social norms around work have evolved in the last 100 or so years, so that certain types of work are just excluded from what we conceive as productive work. And that, what we conceive as productive work gets, so even if it's not explicitly there in the survey, it gets imbibed into how I approach women in work. So I have a picture here for you, which is a woman just doing some cooking in her kitchen. And we've anecdotally heard this, that if an enumerator goes into a household and he sees a woman cooking, he'll or if he actually sees her, that she's a grown woman and she's at home in the 9 to 5 time slot, he'll just automatically, or she'll just automatically categorize her as not working. Now, this is not necessarily true, because she actually could be cooking for a small business that she set up. or she could actually have a very big business that she set up, and she's just taking some time, and she works from home, and she's just taking some time out from that big business to do a little bit of cooking. What's interesting is this, it's not just enumerator bias, which means that there's an undercounting women work. A lot of times there's an inherent responder bias as well. So if I have a small business that I operate out of the home, when the enumerator asks me, do you work? I may turn around and say, no, I don't work, because I don't think of operating that business out of my home as working. So there's a blind spot, not just as far as the survey instrument design is concerned, not just as far as the sampling is concerned, which I talked about earlier, not just as far as the questions being asked is concerned, or the one who's recording. There's not just a blind spot as far as they're concerned, but there might just even be a blind spot as far as the woman is concerned. So how do I fix this picture? There's now quite a lot of work that says that particularly when it comes to women's work, and you're in conservative contexts like Pakistan, which have very strict gender orders and which have very strict division of productive and reproductive work and what is thought of as work, you need to be a lot more intentional in your questions. You need to give a lot more options to women. You need to spend quite a bit of time thinking about how to phrase your question and how to ask the women whether or not she works. In this, time use surveys have been quite successful. Going back to the example that I gave you earlier about time use survey in Punjab, and it requires quite a bit of careful training of enumerators. Of course, this is expensive, so it has budgetary impacts, but perhaps it's worth these budgetary impacts. Now, and why do I say this? When it came to my first blind spot that I talked about, the consequence of not including children, differently able children in my education system, perhaps it's a lot more obvious. But what's the consequence if I don't include women who are working? Who are So women who are actually working, and I'm unable to count them as working. I think it's from a narrative perspective, it's really important. I mean, I'm not necessarily talking about specific service being delivered to these women right now, and I will talk about it in just a bit. But there is an overarching narrative in a lot of countries around the world, including ours, that women not working is costing us in GDP. So in Pakistan, the estimate is that we lose about as much as 30% of our GDP because the women are not working. But I have just highlighted in my previous slide that a lot of women who are working are being undercounted. So this narrative that, look, you're costing us so much GDP would be immediately changed if we start counting them properly. Then there's a narrative about women should take care of children and men should go out and work. So there's a narrative around social norms, there's a narrative around gender roles, and that would also, you would see changes in it if you realized how much women are working, how much of the double burden they're taking on. And here, coming from a very economist perspective, I think data matters. So when you start getting the data right, and you start showing exactly how much women are working. And I'll tell you, when the time use survey was done and we started seeing how much women are spending in reproductive work and how little women are gaining in terms of time when they are working, because they're doing the double shift. Women who are working are gaining only about 40 minutes as far as reproductive work is concerned. So they're doing the productive work, they're also doing the reproductive work. It did change some of the narrative as you start disaggregating how the day is being realized for men versus women. Then let's talk about what happens, what is the service that is delivered to working women. I think that if we start to understand where women are working, what type of work they're doing, we'll start paying more attention to the working conditions that women are working under. As we've become more aware of the type of working conditions that home-based workers face, we've started to understand just the significance of public goods provisioning to ensure that these women who are working outside their from inside their home have adequate electricity, have access to proper public health systems, because they start facing ergonomic issues. So I think that counting women properly does have an impact on the kind of service that is delivered to them. And then once you start figuring out the kind of work that women are doing, the complementary markets, we can start making changes there as well. We can start changing the policies there as well. So think about the credit markets. More and more women are working out of the home using your uh, digital devices. So making sure that, or thinking through the kind of data packages that is provided to these women. These are the kind of services that we start paying attention to once we start counting women's work properly. So I have a little bit of time left. I'm going to talk about blind spots in your monitoring and evaluation systems. Just as a brief overview, your monitoring and evaluation systems are these allow, what we basically do in our M&Es is that we gather data on and we think through all of the information that is gathered anytime a program or an intervention happens. So what is participation like? How are you progressing through the program? Are you achieving your objectives that was slotted for this intervention or not? And the best types of monitoring and evaluation system don't just do a baseline and line evaluation. A lot of them are doing ongoing evaluations of the system as well, because that allows for credible and useful feedback to be incorporated as you continue with the program. Now, if there are biases in this monitoring and evaluation system that you have put in place, your most well-designed, most well-intentioned interventions can end up missing the most marginalized. And what that would mean is that any progress that you're seeing on average can actually mask systemic inequalities, which perhaps would grow as your program or your intervention meets its end. So I'll give you some example. Let's say that I am doing a monitoring and evaluation of an education system or an education intervention that I have put in place in the country. And I see in that on average attendance is improving. But if I miss particular groups and if I am not going specifically talking to girls, your average increases in attendance could mask my gender inequalities. I could have a monitoring and evaluation system of a transportation intervention, which could show that women are using my public transport more. But because I missed women with disabilities in my monitoring mechanisms, it could mask an improvement in women's usage could actually mask that we are leaving out women with disabilities. So I think it's important for us to, when we're thinking about designs overall, whether those are national level systems or whether they're focused interventions or even whether they're focused evaluations of interventions, we have to think about what is happening on the margins. When we're thinking about our sampling frames, are we going ahead and looking at the hardest to reach populations, the geographically remote areas, or the slum areas? Are we designing our instruments in such a way that we are not just going by the easy to gather indicators, but also looking at indicators which help me get to intersectional marginalities? So take the example of women with disabilities or women with disabilities in remote areas or women with disabilities in your low-income slums. Are my indicators able to gather information on these particular intersectionalities? In a lot of cases, these design issues can be solved if you involve communities early on. If you have participatory diagnostics, so the community themselves are telling us these are the kind of diagnostics you should have, this is the kind of instrument you should develop. And I think it's really important for us to be adaptive, to go in with an adaptive mentality. We shouldn't be scared to change things when we realize that something's not working. So there's some interesting examples where countries have closed the data gaps, and that has helped improve policy design. So there's the socio-economic and caste census that was done in India, which allows them to disaggregate caste and income data in a lot more detail. There's a disability inclusive survey that was done in Chile, which made their health system and their health policy a lot more inclusive. So this is all fantastic that all of these concentrated, targeted surveys are being done, but I'll come back to that we really need to think about our national level surveys as well and really consider closing the blind spots as far as these national systems are concerned. Because it's only when your data is inclusive, that your evidence is inclusive, that you can have more inclusive development. I'll stop here and open the floor for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hadia. This was a very telling discussion, and it was very insightful for us to get all these information. We always thought that, data is not being collected properly, and we have like misrepresentation across the data. But now that we know that the data is being collected, but it's not just accounted for correctly, we have a better idea of how to kind of go about it. We have a couple of questions, and I'll take a few of questions and then we can go by round, if that works for you, Dr. Hadia. So we have a question by um Rafun Nabi. He's asking, is it possible to get the, oh, sorry. Uh, 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 just give me a second. Just give me a second. Okay. Okay. Given how the undercounting of women's work, particularly in the informal and unpaid sectors, can distort planning for services like transportation, childcare, and healthcare, what steps can researchers, policy, and policymakers take to ensure this work to properly get recognized, and accounted for in data systems? Um, we have another question that says, how do we bridge the gap between research data and policy making with respect to gender? Uh, this is my last question for this round. When it comes to monitoring and evaluation, how can we better integrate an intersectional lens, one that counts for not just gender, but also class, disability, geography, and other overlapping identities? What are some practical ways to ensure that our M&E systems do not flatten diverse experience into one-size-fits-all indicators? We can take the questions later on. You can answer these questions first, and then we can move to next.
Sure, thank you very much. These are fantastic questions. And actually, there's no easy answer to them because we always face a trade-off as far as like I said, we want our instrument designs to be more inclusive, we want to be more intentional in our questions, we want to be more nuanced in our questions, but that usually comes at the expense of lengthening surveys. Now, I've talked about the cost of lengthening surveys from the perspective of the enumerators or the perspective of the bureaus, right? That it has budget implication. But I also want us to be cognizant of the cost for the respondent. So one of the main reasons why it's so difficult to get high income populations to participate in national surveys is because they just say, my time is too precious. I'm not going to be a part of this survey. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that that's actually true for your low-income populations as well. I just think low-income populations, it is nicer. They just agree to do your survey for you. So we have to balance these costs. Now, one, I think it's really important for us to be very clear on what our policy agenda is. And here I want to go back to the 5-year plans and the 10-year plans that we used to have in place. We need to have buy-ins from larger sections of the population into what our agenda needs to be for the country. But I think one sort of guiding post that we can have are the SDGs, right? So let's say we're following the SDGs, which we are, and we say that poverty is our mainstay as far as policy intervention is concerned. So then you make sure that as far as your survey, when you're designing the survey, it really captures that poverty aspect. And here, maybe you have to get rid of certain parts of your survey, like maybe you get rid of the anthropometric measures so that you can hone in on making sure that you're getting all the intersectional aspects of poverty. So, I mean, this segues into the other question. You're making sure that you're reaching remote populations, you're making sure that you're talking to women from uh, lower caste households as well. So it's a hard reality that you face trade-offs as far as surveying is concerned, and you have to think through how long a survey is going to be, which questions you're going to go more in depth in, and which questions you're going to have to leave out.
Thank you, Dr. Hadia. We have a question, and that says, how do we ensure that data-driven policy processes remain transparent and accountable, especially when working with sensitive information about vulnerable groups?
I think that's a great question. And here I'm going to come to data sharing actually. So we, if you start thinking through what is the kind of data available on Pakistan? One, we have all of that fantastic national level data that the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics gathers. And I hold that it is fantastic data. You can answer so many research questions if you just look at our national surveys. But there's also a whole host of other data systems that are in place. You have the educational management information system, which is being managed by which is being managed in each of the provinces. So what is the data sharing policy of all of these management systems that are in place? You have, in these management systems, you have data available for every single school, and there's real-time data being gathered. So I think it is important to look at these information systems. What is the dashboard like? How easy is it to extract data? And why should data be available for only certain researchers or certain groups? I would argue that if we really want to start understanding what our population looks like, what is the monitoring and evaluation of vulnerable groups looking like, we need to be a bit more open as far as data sharing is concerned. And generally speaking, I think that in Pakistan, data sharing is fairly straightforward, and data is not that hard to come by.
Great. Razik Shinwari asks, thank you for your insightful presentation. From a public policy perspective, considering the expense and limited resource allocated for data collection, triangulation is essential for maximizing benefits. However, this is infrequent due to restricted data access, even for data that could address blind spots. How can improved data access contribute to resolving the identified problem?
So I think triangulation is a really interesting point. And in triangulation, so what I increasingly do actually is, and this is again something that researchers can do. We have our national level data sets. The sampling frame for that is available with the Federal Bureau of Statistics. Why not use similar sampling? Why not use the same sampling frame or as close to that sampling frame as possible to go into the field and gather additional data? And that can be quantitative data and that can be qualitative data. So that can really help you hone in on particular types of problems that are being faced by specific subgroups within the population.
Okay. We have, I think, a couple of more questions. Rather, one of the question is from me. You spoke about how narrow definitions could contribute to, blind spots in our data systems. In your view, can the absence of a universally agreed upon definitions or the existence of too many overlapping ones create further confusions or, exclusion in policy making? How do we can strike a balance between contextual relevance and standardization?
Hmm. This is from you, Shower?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. I mean, it's a great question. So I would, and this is specific to the type of work that I do, I would err on the side of contextual relevance rather than standardization. Standardization is important, so I don't want to detract from that because you want to be able to make comparisons. And if you use similar definitions from what is being, so maybe break the problem into two, right? Start off with the standardized definition, use that to sort of set stage, but have a contextual specific definition as well, context specific definition as well, which helps you really get to the nitty gritty of your research question or really get to the nitty gritty of the problem that you have at hand. Because for better or for worse, the context so actually regardless of whether it's better or worse, the context really matters, right? And particularly when it comes to questions as far as marginalized or vulnerable groups are concerned, or populations for which there has been blind spots historically, it is the context which is so important. And actually it's the context which makes it so difficult to study these groups as well, because you have to understand the entire ecosystem to really figure out why these groups behave in the manner that they do, or why do these groups have the outcomes that they have. So I think as much as I like to peg my results against other groups, as much as standardization is important, in a lot of these cases, it's the context that's going to win out. So I would err on the side of context.
Thank you. Another question again from me. You mentioned that there's a bias on enumerators side and also at the respondent side as well. Um, if you could tell what strategies can we adopt in training our enumerators, or like how we can design our tool to reduce biases that are, that are visible and can ensure invisible labor is, captured in a better way. I'm aware that you kind of touched upon this, but if you could elaborate it more, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can't get around the fact that it's so important to pilot, that it's so important to actually do exercises at the training stage, pairing up enumerators, making sure that the trainer is there listening in on every single conversation, making sure that enumerators are piloting with on their own and also going into the field and piloting. That's really important. Making sure that enumerators I don't just mean that piloting. So one is that you ask the enumerators, go talk to anyone that you can find, right? Go and fill the survey with them. Excuse me, but also you need to have a dedicated week or so where you are going into the field, you pick a community, you go into the field and you talk to them. The more difficult that community to, in some senses, the more difficult that community to get into, the more valuable that piloting is going to be for you, because it sometimes really highlights simple things. Like there's a problem with the translation, that when I was sitting in my office and translating the survey, I meant one thing, but when I go and talk to this community, they're taking it in a completely different manner. So I think that really helps. And your second question was about invisibilized labor, right? So how do I design instruments? There's actually now a lot of work that's taken place in the literature that systematically highlights for you how you should go about asking questions from women about work. What are the options that you should be given? And unfortunately, you need to really go into a lot of detail to get women to talk to you about um, to get women to even identify that yes, I work. And I think here, in the long run, what's going to matter is that what are the social norms around work? How is work being presented to us via social media? And I don't think we should uh, take away from the importance of dramas, books, newspaper, radio shows, TikTok videos. The more conversation we have about invisibilized labor, differently abled children, the more awareness there's going to be about these concepts. And then it'll become easier to survey these populations as well, because the understanding of these ideas will evolve.
We're left with 3 minutes. Can I take one more question? Or should we wrap? Okay. In context where data is scarce, what low cost or rapid assessment techniques would you recommend to avoid leaving entire regions or populations off the map?
Yeah, again, like this goes back to your original question about context, right? If that population has easy access to a phone, then I would say a rapid phone-based survey might be the easiest way to do it. Unfortunately, for a lot of the populations that we really want to talk to, they might be too economically poor to um, have some of them might be too economically poor to have a phone, but some of them might not be allowed. I'll give you an example. If whenever I want to talk to home-based women, I have to be very intentional in my design because she may have a phone in her home, but she may not be allowed to answer the phone, particularly if it's coming from an unknown number. One thing that has helped me personally is to go into hard to access communities with a community partner. So, an NGO that has been in place in that community for a while, or an NGO that has been working with that community for a while. If you go in with a field partner, on the ground partner that the community trusts, it's usually much easier to talk to individuals. And in a lot of cases, if you have a long-term partnership with a on-the-ground NGO, they can even very easily highlight for you, look, here's a marginalized community that generally gets left out, go talk to them. So I think it's really important as researchers to be just open to and continue to talk to those who are on the ground, who are working continuously with these marginalized communities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hadia. This was very interesting conversation, and I really thoroughly enjoyed. And I'm sure our participants are also now more engaged and more informed. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Thank you so much, Dr. Hadia, for your time and wonderful presentation. We loved every bit of this conversation, and we hope to have this discussion moving forward as well. This was a great
Thank you.
opportunity. This was a great opportunity to have you, and I hope we kind of have continued collaboration and supporting conversations again. Thank you so
I
much, everyone.
appreciate it. Thank you
Take,
all. All right. Take care. Bye.
take care. Bye.